Good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Kilbride and I'm from ADHD Ireland. We'd like to thank you for coming along tonight. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule because we know everybody's very busy at the moment. We're running these series of webinars to help people with ADHD. As I say, we would have done a survey in the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that strongly came out, and particularly when we put these things through social media, is the interaction we're getting, that people are looking for more of this type of information. So we would have run one 2 weeks ago with Bonnet Gavin on supporting a child. But as we know now, as much as anything else, we find that we're doing 50% adults, 50% children. So we're delighted that Jonathan Haverkampf has come along tonight to give this talk on ADHD and relationships. Normally at this point in a presentation, I'd go through the qualifications and the expertise of the person. However, Jonathan's is exceptionally long, so I'm going to go straight and skip to that point. However, I will say is, we do get lots of calls from people. We get 1,000 calls from people in Ireland looking to get an assessment for particularly adult ADHD. We get an awful lot of people coming back to us and saying, they have been to Jonathan. We've yet to hear anything negative. Everything's been exceptionally positive. So we're really, very happy that Jonathan's taken his time out of schedule to come along tonight. And at this point, I will hand over to Jonathan. And what Jonathan's going to do is take you through a little short presentation for 20-25 minutes. We asked for some questions in advance, so we have them in already. So we'll put them to Jonathan after that, and then we'll open it to the floor. Just to say, if you do want to ask a question during the presentation, there's a little chat box down the bottom, and you can go into that. You can either send the question generally, or you can send it to myself, which is Ken Kilbride, and there's two Ken Kilbrides, because we both came through the office account, and one of us will get it, and we'll make sure it gets to Jonathan later on. We don't want to send the public stuff. Thank you very much for coming. At this point, I now go quiet and hand you over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Ken, for the very, very kind words. I can say it's, for me, it's a great pleasure, and it's, first of all, of course, to be here tonight. I also enjoy my work very much, and if it helps anyone, or if it helps at least some people, then that to me is very heartwarming. It means a lot to me. Now, I hope everyone can hear me, because obviously I have no indication how the sound quality is, but I hope you're all hearing me, and if not, please let me know. Now, ADHD affects relationships. At least that's what they say. I would modify that a little bit. ADHD can have an impact on relationships, but it doesn't mean that if there's a partner with ADHD in a relationship, or even two partners have ADHD, that it has to impact their relationship in a negative way. It could even impact it in a positive way. Now, just to give you a little bit of an outline what I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about some basic points about ADHD. Maybe also include some information on some questions I frequently hear. I already got some questions in the beginning of the talk, so I'll make sure I'll get back to them. And as Ken said, if you have questions, please send them over, and I'll try my best to answer them as good as I can. Now, apart from a couple of basic points, which is a little more maybe on the theoretical side, or kind of a very or more on the general side, towards the end of my presentation, I will also want to give you several very practical tips and maybe food for thought on how to work or how to improve your relationship if you feel the ADHD is impacting it. Now, so when I said in the beginning that ADHD, research has shown, there's several papers and quite a bit of research that shows that ADHD has an impact, can have a negative impact on relationships. But the interesting thing is when you read those studies and you look at those studies more closely, you will find out that a lot of that has to do with communication. Now, communication is something where we have quite a lot of control. We have quite a lot of influence over our communication patterns. We can change them as long as we're aware of them. We can change them, we can work on them. That's often also what's done in therapy. So also people I would see in therapy or in psychotherapy, we also work a lot on communication patterns, changing them, improving them, bringing them more in line with what you need and what you want, or also what you need and want in a relationship. Aside from my work, of course, also on the medical side, I also, as probably quite a few people know, I also do quite a lot of work on the medication side. So, as I said, it has a lot to do with communication. Now, what I often see is if a partner doesn't understand, and quite often the partners of a person with ADHD who don't understand what ADHD is, or the symptoms it causes, or then there's already a major problem, because a lack of understanding is quite often what interferes in a relationship. So understanding is built from communication. It also builds trust in a relationship. And communication, of course, often means that we have to overcome our fears, and maybe it's also sometimes there can be a shamefulness about having a medical condition. Overcoming that and really sharing how we see things as people with ADHD, to explain it to people who don't have ADHD, to make them understand. So essentially, there's a responsibility on both sides. There's a responsibility on the person who has ADHD to maybe share how they see things, how they feel things, how ADHD works. There's of course a responsibility also on the partner to acquire more information on ADHD. And also, quite often, they will find out that the person they fell in love with in the first place, you know, maybe some of that was also, you know, were maybe some ADHD traits. So it's essentially making it work for both partners. It's teamwork. If you want to improve, or if you want to improve a relationship, it's always teamwork. It always takes two people. Now, so an understanding on both sides is important. And when I get a little more into communication patterns and vicious cycles of communication, it's going to become much clearer. It can also affect studies that show that it affects intimacy, but again, it is from a communication, it has to do with communication. So ADHD by itself doesn't affect the levels of intimacy. ADHD by itself doesn't destroy a relationship. At least I've never seen that. But I've seen people who, with the partner, were stuck in very unhelpful communication patterns. And to make that work, it takes teamwork, but it also takes awareness. And this is why we're going into some, I want to go into some communication patterns, which I often see, and some of those what we call maladaptive communication patterns. Now, I also want to say there has been also studies that say it affects women and men a little differently. That, for example, women might say that if the ADHD partner, if the partner has ADHD and it interferes with their relationship, they feel unloved, and that it has, and they also feel helpless. Now, my experience actually is that all humans want to be loved. So whether it's a man or a woman, I don't think it makes much of a difference. Making it work is kind of beyond gender. I think. I just wanted to say that because, you know, from some quarters, I think there's some discussion about also ADHD and gender, I think. And, you know, it can be helpful, but in some cases, I think it misses the point that we all do need something quite similar. Now, I want to maybe make a short comment also on children with ADHD. Now, the reason is because obviously in a relationship, if a family lives under one roof, children are an important part of that. And, but we also have research into, first of all, that children with ADHD, so it's now the child who has ADHD, can lead to more unstable relationships among the parents. But again, if you look at the research more closely, you will see that that's definitely not a given. It's not something we have to accept. But it really has to do again with communication, how people communicate, how the couple communicates, and how the couple communicates, the parents with the child or the children. Now, one thing which I think I also want to mention, since we're talking about children and ADHD, it has been shown that just the receipt of an ADHD diagnosis, so that the child is diagnosed with ADHD, and the parents are informed about what that means, and so there's information that actually can eliminate the greater instability in a relationship among the parents. So in other words, if the child is diagnosed adequately, is treated adequately, people know what ADHD means, so there's information available on ADHD, it actually means it doesn't have to impact the relationship at all. Well, it can even strengthen the relationship. It can mean working or kind of like playing with the child in a different way, or interacting in a different way, and that can actually even be helpful in the long run. So no, the research says there can be a negative impact of ADHD on relationships from various angles, but I think if we focus on the communication patterns, what's actually going on that level, then it doesn't have to be that way. Now, before going back also to the present and to the relationship, I just also want to mention we all have a past. We have past experiences, and of course, our past doesn't determine our future, but it can impact how we feel in the present. Now, for example, past experiences or also past negative experiences can have an impact on how we feel today in certain situations. Situations can trigger anxiety, can trigger all kinds of feelings. Now, the important part is to become aware of that. And of course, that's also what psychotherapy is for, becoming aware of how past experiences affect us today, of maybe communication patterns, interaction patterns we are using that might have to do with the past. Maybe I want to highlight the two patterns which can play can play a more imminent role. One is attachment avoidance, and one is attachment anxiety. And attachment avoidance means what it says: I'm essentially avoiding attachment. Attachment anxiety means I'm anxious to attach myself to another person. Now, it doesn't need to be that someone has experienced trauma in the past, but if someone had, for example, maybe a parent who suffered from depression, and the parent couldn't mirror as much or reflect the emotions of the child. For example, the child is happy And if the parent, because maybe the parent is suffering from depression, cannot mirror that adequately, the joy back, then the child will become more insecure about its emotions. So there's a lot, you know, I mean, this is just a very small vignette from infant research. There's a lot of research on infants or small children. And now those patterns, of course, you know, it's definitely not the parent to blame, because no one chooses to have a depression. But I think it's good to be aware of that, because over time, like, and this is again where therapy comes in, when we become aware of something, we can change it. Meaning, if I'm, for example, avoiding close or attachment with other people or in relationships, so it could even be intimacy, or I'm anxious of it, by elucidating the past or kind of past experiences and seeing how they affect me today, I can resolve that. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, going into the past. No, I mean, we don't have a time machine. We can't go into the past. So it's not about re-traumatizing, but it's working in therapy on maybe something, you know, certain interaction patterns you notice or communication patterns, and they can then be helpful in once one is aware of it in changing that. And that, of course, also plays a role in ADHD, because attachment, not just attachment and communication are linked, but it is also, if those patterns put in an additional, interfere also with relationships in some relationship in some ways, then of course that can make things even more difficult. So there is a wider component around the ADHD, and I think it's all important to keep that in mind. Now, I think one very important thing to take away is ADHD symptoms aren't destructive in a relationship. So ADHD symptoms don't destroy a relationship or don't impair with a relationship. And I think it's important, because the person with ADHD also doesn't choose to have those symptoms. Now, of course, with medication and therapy, we can do quite a lot to lessen or eliminate those symptoms. But what's causing the problem are not the symptoms, but it's the reaction to the symptoms. It's the response, or also a partner's response to the symptoms, because that triggers another response then in the person with ADHD. And it's like a tennis game, it goes back and forth. So the important thing is, first of all, don't feel bad for having ADHD if you're not the person with the ADHD. If you're the partner, well, there's a lot that can be done. And of course, you know, it's no one's fault. And I think that's important. It's important to work as a team on improving communication, allowing more openness, overcoming fears, overcoming shame, talking about things, talking about how you feel, talking how about you see things. All that improves understanding. Now, and you hear me coming back to understanding, which is, and I think it's very important, because I see a lot of people, when there's a lack of understanding in a relationship, that causes a lot of problems, or can cause a lot of problems. Now, I want to also maybe, because there was one question I saw about impulsivity or emotional impulsivity. Well, emotional impulse or verbal impulsivity is a symptom of ADHD. And I think being aware of that is already in itself helpful. Now, if we know, for example, that in studies, if you take out, if you account for the verbal impulsivity, then there's not more aggressiveness, there's more aggressiveness from a partner who has ADHD. It's the verbal impulsivity that quite often comes across, of course, as aggressiveness. And depending on the response of the partner, that can essentially then escalate and lead to to a very unhelpful interaction, and also a lot of hurt, you know. So the important thing is to realize, well, verbal impulsivity is a part of it, but there's also something that can be done about it. And I think on both sides. Now, there's also hyperactivity, the hyperactive side of ADHD. There have also been studies that people who are more on the hyperactive side, so it's the combined type of ADHD or the more hyperactive side, they quite often, or more often use aggressive conflict tactics, meaning in conflict, it seems like they are using strategies that are not very efficient and come across as more aggressive. But there's, again, it's in therapy, there's, or, you know, even by reflecting on it, that can be changed. Now, it was before going, no, I said I would go into also more practical details. And I wanted to maybe just point out and just quickly a short list of typical ADHD symptoms, because if there are some people in the audience who don't have ADHD, then I think it's important for them also to hear that. Now, the inattentiveness means you lose focus. It means you tune out. It means you're easily bored. Now, if the partner sees you're easily bored, they might think he doesn't care or she doesn't care. Distractibility. Now, if you're easily distractible, it's difficult for you to follow through with responsibilities and promises, but not because you don't want to, because your mind is going somewhere else, which is part of the ADHD. How it comes across to the partner is, of course, he doesn't care or she doesn't care. You might see that there's a certain repetitiveness in that pattern. Forgetfulness, the same thing. Difficulties in organizing things. Yeah, but it's household duties, paying bills, losing things, all that. Yes, the partner could think it's not important to you. You don't care. And in those cases, it's very important to talk about it, because once the partner gets a sense, okay, it's an ADHD symptom, but he actually does care or she does care, that already goes a long way to improving the relationship. Now, social skills, a lot of people forget about social skills. Often, I mean, there's research that shows that people with ADHD might miss out on some subtle signals, nonverbal signals, which maybe someone without ADHD might get a little more easily. Now, so anyone can learn that. Also, someone with ADHD can learn it if there should be something like that. But again, it can come across as, oh, he doesn't see me or she doesn't see me, doesn't understand me, doesn't listen to me. So listening skills would be something also important to practice. Emotional dysregulation, I mentioned that, impulsivity in speech, all those can be symptoms of ADHD and can lead to essentially the partner thinking, oh, my partner with ADHD is, I have a little list here, is lazy, is insensitive, does not care, looks for a fight, and so on. But it is because the partner doesn't understand enough about the ADHD. And I think, you know, it's a responsibility also, of course, on the partner with the ADHD to explain that. That's part of ADHD. And of course, it's a responsibility of the partner maybe to inform themselves what ADHD means. Now, we talked a little bit, mentioned a little bit about the verbal impulsivity and that the hyperactivity can also lead to unhelpful or conflict resolution tactics. Again, all this can be learned, changed, whether it's in therapy, through an ADHD coach, that is things that can really be changed. So now, I wanted to get to a couple of practical things, very practical things. Now, the first thing I want to mention is, or before getting to the very practical things, would be boundaries. It's also important for you to know what's my issue, what's someone else's issue, or what's my partner's issue. Because obviously identifying what is my, for example, ADHD symptom and what's really maybe an issue my partner is having. You know, everyone has issues, is important, and talking about things also can help build those boundaries. Now, external factors can also play a role if there's a stress. I think it's very important in a relationship to identify what's within the relationship and what's coming from without the relationship. And so, for example, if there's a problem at the workplace, then, you know, and the person, for example, with ADHD is under a lot of stress, it's important to identify that, so you're less likely to bring it into the relationship. But of course, you know, you can discuss it with your partner, and maybe there's even something that can be helpful, and maybe you two together can decide, okay, on the weekend we're going to go away and maybe have a really nice weekend, something like that. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the vicious cycle of communication. So essentially what's happening is, I just want to quickly say kind of a couple of points how a non-ADHD partner can feel and how an ADHD partner can feel. And what you see is that in both cases, fear plays an important role. Now, fear is reduced by talking, by communicating about, and not necessarily about the specific thing, you know, for example, if there's a problem, or I don't know, the laundry doesn't get done, but how you talk about it. So when you notice, okay, we're talking in circles here and it doesn't go anywhere, mentioning that and saying, I think, you know, we've been talking back and forth all the time, and I don't think that's very helpful. Let's talk about it, you know, and then you find new ways of maybe communicating about it. So feelings of the non-ADHD partner. From what I mentioned before, could feel ignored, lonely, unloved, unappreciated, feels I cannot rely or trust my partner. My partner doesn't care enough. I'm not being heard. I have to be the responsible one. Builds resentment and anger, increased stress and exhaustion. It's like treading on eggshells. I don't know, and that's often coming from not really understanding enough about ADHD. It's like, I don't even know what I can do, you know, to trigger something. In the end, there's going to be blame, frustration, anger, withdrawal, and of course, withdrawal is toxic for a relationship. But again, in the end, it's a lot about fear. You know, we're not talking about it. Now, interestingly, something very similar happens on the side of the partner with ADHD. The partner with ADHD might think, oh, my non-ADHD partner is micromanaging me, you know, becoming a control freak. All this leads to avoidance, or just saying, I'll say what they want to hear. You know? So I don't, it's like almost, I give up, you know, because I can't make it right. So I'll just say whatever they want to hear. And of course, then there's going to be disappointment on the other side. So feeling unfairly judged, resentful because there's this constant criticism, or it's experienced as constant criticism. Feeling overwhelmed, unloved and unwanted, even though there's strong longing to be accepted and not longing to be loved. And that leads to downplaying severity, excuses, denial, and withdrawal. So essentially, again, the same thing, withdrawing from the relationship. So that's the person with ADHD. And there's also fear behind it for this behavior. So fear on both sides. One thing I want to mention is, in some relationships, what I've seen is then there's a tendency to not say anything. Now, silence is even worse than an emotional outburst, because silence is like the death nail. It's toxic to a relationship. So, you know, try to stay away from silence. Communication is what's really important. Now I see I'm already, the half an hour is almost up. Now, if you give me another maybe 10 minutes, I would go more into, because I promised that I would talk about a couple of practical points, what can be done. And I think that would still be important if that's okay for everyone. I think we still then have enough times for the Q&A. So let's talk about survival strategies. Now the basics. First of all, acknowledging ADHD does impact my relationship. As I said before, it's not directly because it has an impact on the communication, how you interact with your partner plays a large role, but ADHD does impact your relationship. And I think acknowledging that is an important part if you're the person with ADHD. Do not wait, because at some point the resentment might be getting to such a point where everything is then kind of beyond repair. And so ADHD also, I think it's important to acknowledge that ADHD can change one's perspective on things. But again, it's a thing that is, can be changed again. So it's definitely not anything permanent. The blame game must stop. The back and forth. If you're getting into that communication, I think it's important to take a step back, look at it, and talk to your partner about how you're communicating. Get away even from the issue, but talk about, this is how I see what we're doing at the moment. And I think we both don't want that. So let's find ways to do it differently. And if you need a timeout or a break, then talk to yourself. Don't just leave the room. Tell your partner, okay, I think what we need to do is, let's talk about it. But I think first, let's go to our own little space, think a little bit about it, how we feel. Let's feel about it. And then we come back in 10 minutes or 15 minutes and we'll talk about it. Nagging, of course, criticizing, all that. It's doesn't help, So there's a responsibility, as I mentioned in the beginning, on both people. The partner with the ADHD to also get treatment, and to also work on those communication patterns together with the other partner. Non-ADHD partner for their own behavior, their own issues. Not everything has to do with the ADHD of the partner. And also maybe correcting some misconceptions. I mean, there are misconceptions, and especially when it comes to ADHD, information can save a relationship, as can communication. So it's a shared responsibility. Now, something general before I'm then kind of like we'll close off in a couple of minutes with the more specific things. So respect is important, humor is important, meta communication, as we call it, talking about what's happening rather than getting lost in the details, making time for doing enjoyable things. Don't forget about the relationship. There's still a relationship to be lived, and everyone deserves to be happy. Only one crazy person at a time. Don't have two crazy people at a time, only one crazy person. And thinking awareness, thinking about solutions. If it, often an outside person can help. So a couple therapist, a couple counselor. Observe what's going on. If you need to take a step back, do that. Become aware, reflect, and then change and experiment a little bit with communication. Now, a couple of tips for adults with ADHD, and after that, a couple of tips for people without ADHD. So for the person with ADHD, as I said, acknowledge the symptoms and that your partner is not necessarily unreasonable, but they actually probably do care. Take responsibility for the symptoms. Yes, there is treatment, and I have seen when people, when it's on the psychotherapy side, on the medication side, make themselves available or make use of what's out there. I've never seen, if someone says, okay, this relationship is important to me, I want to make it work, they can make it work. There's a lot of techniques and strategies and help out there. Be honest with your limits, strengths and weaknesses. Very important. It's also when you divide up chores. Now, don't give the chore, like for example, if it's something very repetitive or kind of, or if it's something which is time sensitive, well, maybe that's the non-ADHD person doing that. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the person with ADHD just picks all the great things. No, there might be something. A lot of people with ADHD are very creative. very innovative, very, so pick the things, and even whether it's ADHD or not, look at your strengths, meaning kind of like get some insight into yourself and see what you can do well and what you can't, and you divide it up. Also, for the person with ADHD, acknowledge, and if something happens and you feel I kind of I would like to apologize for it, do it, because if you apologize, the other person is probably going to be more likely to also forgive, assume a responsibility, and also apologize in the future. Now, for the person without the ADHD, do not parent a person with ADHD. It's I mean, he or she is not a child. Unfortunately, I quite often see that. Now, recognize your partner's limitations. Again, strengths and limitations. I think it's for both partners, whether it's ADHD or not, to identify what they can do well, what they're good at, and what they're not. So, divide it up, talk about it. It doesn't mean you should take on all the tasks. Swap them. Find the right mix. So there should be a relationship needs to be balanced over time, especially emotionally, but also as far as practical things goes, chores. So find a balance. And the interesting thing is when you feel, oh, I can't talk to my partner about that, I can't, do it, because you're showing you care about the relationship. When it comes to a relationship and you feel something is not working, communicate, as if you were fighting for your life, because in the end, you will make the relationship work much better. Now, for the person without the ADHD, do not take ADHD symptoms personally. Unfortunately, I see too many people who take ADHD symptoms personally. However, if you know more about ADHD, and that's why it's great, I hope there are people also attending, and I not just hope, I'm very thankful for people who are attending tonight who don't have ADHD. The more you know about ADHD, the easier it will be for you not to take it personally and not to get into a kind of a vicious cycle of recriminations or blaming or all that. Now, I said in the beginning, remember the fun ADHD traits, which you maybe fell in love with in the beginning. Don't forget those, So now I have a couple of, I wanted to say that in general, again, listening skills are important. Sit down when you talk to someone, make eye contact. If you don't hear a question, or if you don't understand something, ask. Listen openly without judgment. Ask for breaks if you don't need it, and don't make assumptions. Now, because I know I'm going over time, I can tell you what I've left. I mean, of course, I'm happy to discuss anything you might have. I still have a couple of course, organizational tips, but that's just if people want to hear that. Now, I have 3 other areas which, if people are interested, of course, I could talk about. The one is fighting about chores. I mentioned a little bit about that. The other one are emotional outbursts, and the other one are parenting. It's essentially also kind of a couple of short points, maybe would be 3 minutes each or so, but I just want to make that optional because I don't want us to run out of time. So how do I give it back now to Ken?
Okay, you've just done that. That's very easy. That's appreciated. That's very simple. What I want to say is, just for myself listening in there, I don't think I have ADHD, but I would have found that very interesting, very enlightening. I'd have to say it was very interesting to hear from it. It was really a human presentation of it, rather than a medical one, which I think was, really, really useful. It gives that sort of perspective on it. And
Hello?
I'm not taking it as an exact quote, but only one crazy person at a time, and that crazy person doesn't have to be the one with ADHD either. So again, communicate medications is really, 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 really important. Could I just ask you just one of the first questions that come in that I would have seen myself? Do adults with ADHD seem to have far more relationships than the average person? Do they get bored easily and crave excitement, so relationships tend to fizzle out? Is there an element of fear of commitment within adults with ADHD?
That's a very good question. Adults with ADHD, I mean, there is, I would say from my experience, I mean, I would have to check the research. I would say, yes, in some cases you see that people with ADHD have more relationships, but the problem is when you look at the statistics, I would say that people who say there are lots of people also have been in committed long-term relationships, people with ADHD. So it's again, how to make it work. Now I want to say something about why there might be a pattern of kind of repeats, let's say repeat relationships. Because what happens is often in the beginning, a person with ADHD, when they hyperfocus on a new relationship, to the partner, it looks like they feel, I mean, let me see. I actually, there was kind of something I skipped over. So what can happen is, and so essentially it has to do with hyperfocus, that in the beginning, a relationship is new, it's novel, a person with ADHD hyperfocuses, the other person feels very appreciated, feels very positive. It's essentially like, you know, it's not just a honeymoon phase, but it's a honeymoon phase squared. What can happen, of course, in the person with ADHD is then at some point, and that can, of course, have to do with the ADHD, something does get boring, so it's not new anymore, it's not novel anymore, and that can lead to quite a bit of hurt on the other side. And the other partner notices, okay, the person with ADHD is not so interested in me anymore. Now, quite honestly, I've seen it in the literature, but in my experience, that doesn't really happen that often. And also, if a person with ADHD, you know, whether someone has ADHD or not, people can commit, and people with ADHD absolutely can commit. So if anyone with non-ADHD who doesn't have ADHD feels a person with ADHD, stay away from that person because he cannot commit, or he's always gonna go for something novel. That's not true, you know. And, you know, especially in a person who's aware of his ADHD. So, you know, I just wanted to have said that because I think it's important.
Okay, just another quick question. Just my internet going a bit funny there, so if I zoom in and out, forgive me. Just one about work, actually. I often get irritated when I feel what I'm being reproached of work is unfair, and I find it difficult not to feel threatened, not to lose my temper, to get frustrated. And basically, how can I manage disagreement or conflict constructively in the work environment? Where is it another type of relationship we all have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, relationships, you know, our whole life consists of relationships. Talk about it. A lot of people are afraid to talk about it. Now, I had people who I even said, you know, I mean, who asked me, can I talk about my ADHD at the workplace? And I said, why not try it and see what happens? Now, I didn't have a single case where someone talked about their ADHD, or for example, that they need to do tasks in a certain way. For example, you know, if someone with ADHD I mean, it would be good in the workplace if tasks are maybe in chunks and it's not, you know, constant multitasking. But my experience is that an employer is usually very open and even happy to hear that. Now, an employer who doesn't seem to care, I would quite honestly, I would think about, is this the right place for me? So.
Okay, just yeah, that's pretty simple. Just have a look at the group chat, and one of the, not the same type of question, but the topic that's coming up, it's around emotional outbursts, and probably how do you cope with that from both sides of the equation? Okay,
emotional outbursts. Now, the first thing is, I think, to realize is an emotional outburst. An emotion is fundamentally a good thing. That's why it's called an emotion. It moves something. You know, it brings something into motion. So just switching off emotions is definitely not, shouldn't be the option, because it's just going to make it worse. You're going to feel even more pressure. So in other words, what it means is identifying what emotion I have. And that's often a difficult part. Now for anyone, not just for people with ADHD, but for someone with ADHD, particularly maybe, it's important to identify the emotion. What am I feeling? And trying to put that into words. Again, I know I'm coming back very often to communication, but it really is what saves, you know, I've seen saved a lot of workplaces and relationships or situations at the workplace. So emotional outbursts, yes, it's important to realize ADHD can lead to emotional impulsivity. But the more you have an insight into why, you know, kind of what's happening, taking a step back, maybe thinking about what triggered that, feeling what I really feel, can essentially kill the emotional outburst. Because if an emotional outburst means I don't even know what emotion is there. And this is what, when I get afraid and there's an outburst, I'm helpless. But the moment I can identify it, for example, sadness or anger, then I can work with that. I can even talk about it, and and people actually usually, you know, if I tell my partner, you know, what you just did, I know you love me. What you just did made me really angry. No, I know you were not trying to hurt me intentionally, but you know, can we maybe figure out what's going on? So essentially, what you're doing is you recognize, you kind of acknowledge the emotion of the other person, you acknowledge your own emotions, and then you try together to find a solution. You talk, I'm angry, but if you say I'm angry, I know you weren't trying to hurt me, or I know you love me, but what you just did specifically made me angry, makes the emotional outburst unnecessary. Now, if you feel it's on an impulse and it just happens, from whenever I work with people, I've never seen a case where it really comes totally out of the blue. There's usually a history to that. For example, what happened that day or 5 minutes before, or what thoughts are you going through your head? So work with a therapist on that, and it can be, something can be done about it. But don't just put a lid on it, because the pressure in the pressure cooker just goes up. So that's how I would say that, if that makes sense.
Okay. Is Anne going to do the next question?
Yeah, I can feel the next question.
Yeah.
A question there, Jonathan, from Antia in the group chat. She's
Yes.
wondering if you have any advice for a couple when a partner is in denial that they have ADHD despite having all the symptoms. And also in this situation, she's saying that the child was also recently diagnosed with ADHD,
Yeah.
but the parent is struggling to accept or get informed about the condition.
Okay. I mean, first of all, of course, there's a question, why is the partner having such a hard time with it? Is the partner afraid? Is there shame involved? Does maybe the partner even think that, you know, ADHD means, oh my God, you know, the relationship is going to be over or something? So quite often, in my experience, it comes down to fear. Now, as a partner, you're not supposed to be the therapist. Even the best therapist in the world, or every therapist doesn't do therapy in the family. So if you feel you're slipping into the role of a therapist, you're the partner. And what you can say is, of course, you pick up something specific. You say, well, I see, kind of, for example, whatever the issue is. I mean, it's probably, that's not the issue, but, you know, whenever we want to leave for the weekend, you're always late, and you know, it's and I know you do care, you know, but I read an article the other day, you know, about ADHD, and it doesn't really seem to fit. Wouldn't it be good to kind of, like, you know, at least talk to someone about it? Now, I know, you know, for if the person is heavily in denial, this is not going to work. But so what I would do is talk to someone about it, like, you know, for example, a therapist, where you can talk through some strategies. You know, I don't want to use the word manipulation, but strategies, you know, how to package it, how to do it in a way that reduces fear and maybe shame or whatever it is on the other side. But again, don't become a therapist at the same time. Would be my sense.
Thanks, Jonathan. Another question that's an interesting one there from Tara Are there any good online resources for a non-ADHD partner who doesn't believe that ADHD exists?
Well, is that question now coming from someone with ADHD or not with ADHD?
I don't know, actually. You
don't know, okay.
It's not clear. Maybe
okay.
if Tara's there, she could comment on that.
Okay. Well, if she does, if she doesn't, I mean, first on the online resources, there are great online resources out there. Some of the major teaching hospitals in the world, they have short synopsis on ADHD, what ADHD is, what the symptoms are, kind of like, you know, on relationships and ADHD. There's also a lot of stuff out there. Maybe the best idea would be if she wants to send me an email, and you know, maybe I can, or if she says specifically what she wants, maybe if my email address is anywhere, of course, people can always send me an email and say, you know, do you have an idea on that? Or do you know where I could find that? And I might not be able to respond the same day or the same hour, but eventually I would get to it. Yeah.
Tara has come back to us there to say she has ADHD, but her partner doesn't believe it.
Her partner doesn't believe that she has ADHD. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it's important then for her to say, you know, the question is what the diagnosis is for. Now, if the partner feels, oh my God, now, you know, there's an excuse for everything. It's the ADHD. I don't want that, you know. Then I think it's very important for her to say, well, that's not the point. The point is to understand what's going on so we can work together on it. It doesn't mean, you know, I'm shirking all responsibilities or not going to do anything anymore, or just lose stuff because I feel like losing stuff. But it's working together on making our relationship better. So say the reason why I'm looking for a diagnosis, looking into that, is to improve our relationship, you know. And maybe to even ask him, you know, what are you afraid of, or why, you know, and maybe even reading something together on ADHD, like, you know, educational films, there's videos, and if he's totally saying, no, I don't want to hear about that, then I would say, okay, but this could really improve our relationship. Don't you want to improve our relationship? You know, I mean, I know this is provocative, but still, that's probably what I would do.
Keep it really positive. Yeah.
Exactly.
Another question, Jonathan, if you want me to keep going.
Absolutely. I have plenty of time, so we can go as long as you want to. No issue.
Mary has asked, have you any advice for healing a broken relationship with an adult son with ADHD? The son hasn't spoken for almost a year, and his main accusation is that he's always been lied to. So son himself has ADHD here.
My suggestion would be, first, take out the ADHD. You know, ignore, I mean, of course, I'm not saying take it out, because if a relationship has gotten to the point where kind of like what she was describing is, I think it's important to not make it about ADHD, but to make it a relationship between, I think, yeah, it was a mother and a son. And, you know, also saying, you know, again, communication, kind of like, you know, I don't know what she tried, whether she was trying to get in contact with him or what she talked to him. But this is, you know, then you as a mother who want a relationship with your son, I would kind of like, you know, ADHD, of course, has certain patterns that go with it. But in the end, we are all people. And I think, so I would not think too much about the ADHD at the moment. Of course, I would be aware of it, that there's certain patterns that maybe kind of certain interaction patterns, or he might maybe impulsivity, things like that. Now, if he becomes impulsive, of course, you can say, okay, that's partly his ADHD, or it's his ADHD. But on the other hand, I think building a relationship, it would, when it's people with ADHD or non-ADHD, it starts essentially with just telling the other person, you know, I care. I want, you know, I love you. That's why I'm doing this, you know. And if you tell another person, you know, I want to talk to you about things because I love you, well, it's very difficult for the other person to say no.
Okay, well, thanks for it again. What I would like to do try now is maybe take some questions from people that are actually live here tonight. And now this is a bit more random than in an auditorium where we can see the people walk around with a microphone. So if you can put your hand up if you do want to ask a question, and we'll try and get to you, and I will unmute you, and then you can do that. So does anybody want to ask a question there? Okay, sorry, go to Hannah.
Yeah,
It's all
thanks.
yours.
Ken. Hi, Jonathan. I submitted a question, so I don't know if it got through or not.
Oh, okay. I have a list of 6 questions, and is it one of them?
Talking too much.
Talking too much. Talking too much. Yes,
Number
talking
2.
too much. Okay. Yeah, talking too much. Why is that a problem?
Well, I think especially now, I like to talk, but that means other people don't get a chance sometimes in meetings and so on. And in intimate relationships, it's not actually that bad, or it hasn't been. But with friends now, and especially on the phone, if it's not face to face, I suppose I find myself talking, even though at the same time I know the other person is either, I can hear that they want to say something, or I listen to the first bit and then jump in again. And I just feel it's unfair to friends who want me to listen to them, and
Well,
yeah.
You said you like to talk. Then
Yes.
talk. What's the problem?
It is if a conversation is me talking and nobody else getting a chance to talk, or me not listening to the
And
person.
what's the problem? What problem is that causing?
Oh, okay. I'm now wary of phoning people. I know a lot of it is me, but I'm aware of, so I email, and I hate emailing. I'd much prefer to pick up the phone and talk to people. At the end of every call, not every call, but a lot of calls, I'm saying to myself, I just say, I knew I wasn't listening there. It's like 2 voices in my head, what I'm saying and what I want to do.
So are people saying that you should stop that?
Not usually, but I get signals, or they'll say, you're not listening, or can do, friends. And
Okay. So there is a little bit maybe kind of on the listening side, but the interesting thing is you can say a lot as long as you give people also a feeling or a sense that you're listening, and you're listening at the moment and you're actually nodding your head. So I have a sense you can also be a good listener. So maybe one of the reasons why people are not saying, okay, we don't want to talk to her anymore is because you're also a good listener, Now, of course, I'm not saying maybe yes, maybe you can work a little bit on kind of saying, okay, I'll let the other person talk, but maybe people also want to listen to you, maybe you have something to say, and I think you do. So ADHD, or, whether we're talking about with ADHD or not, as I said in the beginning, the ADHD is not the problem. The problem is what we do with it. People with ADHD can be highly creative, highly successful, and even without medication. So the important point is when you feel, okay, maybe I'm saying a little too much. Next time, and you say, okay, maybe I really want to say that, but let someone else talk, and then you say your thing, because if you have more time to think about what you're going to say, it might even be a little better, so you let the other person talk, we listen, and then you say your thing. But don't don't stop saying something. That's not, it's with the emotions, it's the same thing, we have a right to our emotions, we have a right to saying something, and my sense is maybe people want to listen to what you have to say.
Thank you.
At least I wanted to listen to what you have to say, so
okay, thank you.
There's lots of questions in. Just another one, just in terms around the nature of people with ADHD. Can people with ADHD do long distance relationships, or do they need to have the intimacy and the immediacy of having someone in front of them? if you take where we are now, you know, everybody's on Zoom, and you can
Yeah.
only travel to 5 kilometers, wherever it happens to be. How does that work when you have ADHD in terms of, you know, long-term relationships or long distance, excuse me?
Well, I was just thinking whether I've seen anyone who actually had intimacy on Zoom. I don't think that has happened yet. I'm not quite sure. So
That's a different one.
But, you know, intimacy, I mean, when we talk about intimacy, it's kind of interesting, you know, it's not always just one thing, you know. Intimacy can come on many levels. So you can be intimate with someone even, I think, even over Zoom in some way, you know. Now, do people with ADHD have more difficulties with it? I would say yes and no, you know. Now, Zoom has the advantage that you're blocking out a lot of other information. So it could even help you focus, you know, to talk to one over Zoom. Now, of course, long distance relationships, some people have problems with them. Some people say this is never going to work. And some people say, okay, you know, this actually maybe is the thing for me. I don't really think it has much to do with ADHD. I mean, as I mentioned on intimacy, and I mean, there is research on intimacy and ADHD, which shows there might be a greater problem with intimacy in people with ADHD in general. But as I said, if you work on the communication, then it ceases to be an issue. So, you know, see what you're doing, see how you're communicating. And if you don't want a long distance relationship, by all means, you know, I mean, if it's not fulfilling, don't do it.
Okay. Just we want to take another question from people here, but
yeah,
if you want to take the question, you need to turn your camera on, so we can see you. So if you are interested in putting a question, could you turn your camera on and put your hand up? No, I can't see anyone there. So, just going back then to the chat.
Yeah.
People with ADHD, can they be more anxious about getting into a relationship in the first place, and particularly if they know about it and they've had, you know, stigma and self-esteem issues around themselves?
Stigma is a big issue. Stigma is, unfortunately, you know, mental health in general, there's a stigma to it all the time that will, I mean, I think that is changing slowly because obviously there's no reason for stigma. And that, of course, applies to ADHD as well. Now, I would say, you know, if you are on a date and you talk about your ADHD, or you mention it, I have ADHD, and the person takes off, then say, good riddance. I'm happy he took off, because you don't want to be with someone who doesn't accept you as you are. Now, that's just one thing. People with ADHD, I mean, my sense is people with ADHD are more anxious because they themselves, you know, I mean, if society is telling you or is stigmatizing something, you're essentially internalizing it, and you feel yourself it might be a problem. But I think once you cease to see it as a problem or as a defect or anything, I think you will be less anxious when you go on a date or when you talk to other people, because your mind essentially projects your own fears and your anxieties into the other person, because that's what our mind does, because we cannot mind read. So we are then surrounded by people who share our fears, but it's really our own. So important is come to terms with the ADHD, learn that it's definitely nothing to be ashamed of, afraid of. Don't stigmatize yourself, and then it's much easier and you will be less anxious when you go on a date.
Okay, good. And the next question?
Yeah, Jonathan, there's a good few questions actually on organization skills and any advice you might have in that area, but there's just one specific one which might help guide your answer. Caroline asked, as a partner of someone who has ADHD, where they refuse to use tactics to help them remember things, like writing things down or setting reminders, how can she help them without constantly having to remind them of everything over and over again?
Okay, and the partner with ADHD is not willing to essentially use techniques to make it work.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I said, you know, organizational tips, essentially, you know, when you're talking about, as I said in the beginning, you know, identifying strengths and weaknesses and essentially dividing up chores, according to strengths and weaknesses, requires talking about it, you know, and essentially my sense is, and I just wanted to mention one other thing on the organizational side. Well, I mean, sometimes it can be even, you know, if something is too cluttered or something is not working, well, get a professional, you know. I mean, there are ADHD coaches out there. You know, there are even people who can clean your apartment. I mean, I'm just saying, you know, it's if it gets really bad. But what she is mentioning essentially is that it sounds like her partner maybe doesn't kind of has an ambivalence about his own ADHD. So maybe he doesn't want to talk about it. Maybe he doesn't want to admit, you know, maybe he doesn't want to talk about his ADHD because he's afraid of something. If that's the case, I think there needs to be a talk about the kind of like, you know, well, you know, it affects the relationship. So essentially telling the partner, you know, this relationship is important to me and you're important to me, but something is not working and it breaks my heart because I see it could be working if we could just make it work together, and, you know, mentioning the together thing. Now, I think that makes it difficult for the other person to say no to that, you know, just, you know, so communicating in a way would be my sense. Now, if you feel it's not going anywhere, well, yeah, it becomes, it essentially then becomes a topic about, or an issue about the relationship. But I would try to essentially appeal his sense, because obviously he wants to be in a relationship, and I would make it clear to him that this now becomes part actually of the relationship, you know, and he needs to, but you're willing to work with him, and that's important, you know.
Okay.
And then in general, sorry, Ken, in general for organization skills, then Jonathan, is there anything else that you'd?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things, you know, as you mentioned, I mean, I mentioned the strengths and weaknesses. There are a couple of techniques. I put down a couple of points here. You know, finding, for example, if an organization, well, actually that goes back to the question, if an organizational strategy is not working or may feel strange to you, well, it might work for the other person. So the important thing is, when it comes to organization, everything that works is good, even if you feel well the other person is doing it in a very, very strange way, but they have to find their own way then. Now, there can be little things like specific areas for things that often get lost, visual reminders. You mentioned that, decreasing clutter, which might, sometimes there are actually people who help with clutter, organizational tools for bills, papers, etc. Weekly family meetings, people do that, you know, where they essentially talk about upcoming week's events and responsibilities. I know I was just kind of a little list of things. So structuring things, you know, and you know, calendar on the fridge, all kinds of stuff. I mean, ADHD coaches are actually quite good for that. So you might actually even consult an ADHD coach, and maybe that, you know, even if you're not the person with ADHD, and there might be some tips or extra tips, also books on little things, and the little things make our life, they determine our life to an extent, you know. So organizational things, clarity, talking about things in clear ways, not saying, okay, we'll talk about it. We're talking about it on Tuesday at 5 o'clock. Clarity, dividing up things, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Maybe if in the previous question, you know, that's maybe one of his weaknesses, maybe he has another strength where you're actually very happy if he does that. So dividing up things, you know, but it means talking about it.
Okay, thanks for that. Just a question. It hasn't come up as a specific question, but lots of people have touched on it. We're talking about ADHD, but there's also a lot of coexisting conditions that go with ADHD.
Yes.
So in terms of relationships, you know, talk about conduct disorder, ODD, and possibly rejection sensitivity dysphoria.
Yeah, right. That was one of the questions. I'll quickly also go through the list of questions here. Now, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Is it common in ADHD? I would say, in my experience, not so much. I think, you know, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, of course, can be a feature of ADHD, but it is only one. You know, if the only thing you have is rejection sensitivity dysphoria, then there's probably something else going on, because you might also have that in depression, anxiety, certain other things as well, in different forms. So is it common? Well, yes, you see it, but I think it is. I think more is made out of it than there should be, is my sense. Now, if you self-experience that, then I think it's of course it makes a lot of sense to look into that and see what might be going on. Is there something else underlying it? That's probably how I would say it. It's not really a core feature of ADHD. Yeah. And any tips? I'm just looking at the question. Any tips on how not to feel responsible to blame for everything in family life? Well, if you're feeling responsible for everything or to blame for, I think it is very important. Now, it depends on whether it's the person with ADHD. If that's the case, then I think, as I said before, this needs to be talked about, because obviously you can't, you can only be responsible for all your own little sphere. And I would probably discuss that with the therapist a little more in detail, because there needs to be a more detailed approach to that, would be my sense, you know. But don't, if you feel responsible for everything or blame for everything, you know, talk to someone about it, because I think, yeah, that would be a good idea. Now, if it's okay, there's 6 questions. I can quickly in a few minutes just go through them. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Yep. The second question is, I have ADHD and would like some advice on how to stop myself from talking too much. Oh, yeah, we covered that.
We've done that.
There's a complete breakdown. Huh?
We've done number 6 as well. We've done 2
6
already.
as well. 3, I think 3. We still haven't covered 3. There's a complete breakdown in communication.
Yeah,
oh, we did that too. Okay, if so, 4 is left.
1, so.
Discuss emotional dysregulation. Is that what's left? Okay, or maybe 4 and 5. Now, emotional dysregulation in ADHD. I talked about emotional outbursts, and I think I did talk a little bit about the emotional side. So it's not really emotional dysregulation. I mean, yes, it is also the emotional dysregulation. But if the emotional dysregulation is on the foreground, it might not actually be just ADHD. As Ken said before, there's a high comorbidity of ADHD with other things, or Anne or Ken, I don't know, one of you two. There's a high comorbidity. So if you feel on the emotional side, it's a roller coaster ride, you know, if in an assessment for ADHD, I mean, what I usually do in an assessment, I would look for, you know, like also things that could be comorbid with ADHD. There might be something else going on as well, you know, because it's definitely, I mean, if it's the main thing, then I would look into it. Now, if it's part of the ADHD just, or, you know, a couple of things, what I mentioned about emotional outbursts, like, you know, emotional dysregulation, of course, is a core symptom, but it's just one of the symptoms. And I think what it can also help with, the point is not to put a lid on your emotions, but to also make clear to your partner that it is a symptom of ADHD. Now, you might be, for example, you know, that can be, you know, easy to anger, unintentionally aggressive, all that. However, when you're talking with your partner about it, you know, or you might be unaware that you're talking too loud. That often happens also, people with ADHD. So if you talk to your partner about it, you might together actually be able to identify triggers and signals, or you might identify it yourself, which can also help. Or maybe some subtle cues you're not picking up. Sometimes, you know, timeouts help, but the most important thing is, if there is an emotion, there's usually a reason for it. Identifying it lessens the emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation means the emotion isn't yet identified. If you know you're sad, if you know you're angry, that's a very good step. Then I think number 5 we had when talking about fulfilling sentimental relationships, is there a technique or way of not ending being delusively accommodating in the relation, or in other words, not lying to yourself. Now, delusively accommodating, I would say, is not necessarily, is there maybe a fear that you're losing a relationship, or, you know, there are 8 billion people in the world, so the person you're in a relationship with is probably not the only one. I mean, there could be fears behind it. There could be, I'm just looking at the question. I don't know anything about the background. But the question is why you're being so accommodating. Could it be because you're maybe afraid of something? And is it maybe kind of how you feel about yourself? Could it be, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's probably, I would talk to someone about it. There is in the relation, in other words, not lying to yourself. Well, lying to yourself, I mean, it's interesting. It doesn't really have, it's not just ADHD, it's everyone. When a relationship, when someone comes and says, oh, I was for 5 years in a relationship and the last 3 years, maybe it was really bad or even abusive. When you ask people, you know, first they feel, well, how can I protect myself? Because I had no clue what was happening. Well, there are usually early warning signs. There are signals. We overlook them. You know, we all do. I don't think every one of us has been there. The important thing is, you know, to know what your boundaries are. You know, if you're becoming delusively accommodating, it means you know, where are your boundaries? Where is your space? And where do you recognize what's your thing and what's someone else's thing? You know, also you cannot change another person. You know, only people themselves can change it. So no matter how accommodating you are, no matter how much you say yes to everything, it actually, you know, that actually ends a relationship. So if you reach that point, think about, you know, what's in the relationship, what's in it for me, you know, what's in it for me. And I'm not saying being selfish, but essentially taking stock of the relationship, really assessing it.
Okay, so thanks very much for that. Just a very couple of quick points. Coming up 20 past 8. I did say to Jonathan's wife, just in terms of good communications, I get him out by about 8:30. So if you have any more questions, stick them into the group chat now and before we go. And just in terms of the next question, Anne, do you have one there?
Yeah, I have one here that came in on the chat from Christine.
Yeah.
It's a good question that we get quite a lot in our support groups.
Okay.
Should you tell people, like friends or your parents or whomever, that you actually have ADHD? And this person was diagnosed when she was 45. So a lot of people ask us that. Should they tell other people that they have ADHD?
Well, if you feel it helps, do it, you know. For some people, it can be a relief to talk about it and, you know, to essentially share that. It doesn't make you a different person because, just because you're telling someone else that you have ADHD, you're still the same person. That doesn't change. But some people might feel it can be really helpful because and it can also be helpful for someone else to maybe understand a little bit more about you. Of course, you're not the ADHD, you're not a condition, you're yourself. But maybe, you know, some traits, if they know about it, it can be helpful. But do what's comfortable for you. You don't have to, absolutely not. I mean, that's definitely not. If you feel it's helpful to you, if it has some benefit, you know, then I have never seen, at least in my experience, that if people felt it was important to them to talk about it, well, maybe the other person doesn't know anything about ADHD, is skeptical about ADHD. Well, but still, what's lost, you know, I would say. So
okay, thanks.
Do what's comfortable.
Just in that, there's been a couple of questions. It's not strictly on relationships, but a couple of questions. Does Jonathan do adult diagnosis? The answer to that is yes. What I do have to say, as ADHD Ireland, you know, there is other providers in the market. You'll find on our website, ADHD Ireland, the list of clinicians who are available. But just if Jonathan can just give a quick overview of how do you get an adult diagnosis?
Okay.
What's the process?
So when you assess for ADHD, it's essentially, first of all, I mean, what I use is I use psychometric questionnaires, which are kind of also used quite a bit in research. I would never base a diagnosis on a score or anything, but the questions are helpful in identifying maybe the type of ADHD. I use quite a few because, as I said, there's a high comorbidity. So I would use not just ADHD questionnaires, but a couple other ones as well. Then I would use a cognitive assessment where you essentially do a couple of tasks, takes 45 minutes. This summer I'm switching provider to Cambridge Brain Sciences. They kind of like, you know, they are also used a lot in research. And when you get all this information, and then essentially the most important thing is to discuss, you know, what are the issues, what are the problems, where's your life not working, where is it working? And then, and then you know, there's a diagnostic manual, there are a couple of points, you know, everyone could read the definition of, you know, the diagnostic manual, what ADHD, what that means. But it does take essentially, I would usually do it in 2 sessions, and in 1 session in between, there would be questionnaires. Now, I usually also, what I would ask people to do is, I mean, of course, if someone has already been diagnosed with ADHD, that's a different issue, but quite often that if they have a psychotherapist, or if they have never seen a psychotherapist, or so, to maybe also have a session with them to maybe see, you know, if there's some other underlying issues with it. But again, it's just because it's good practice in most guidelines. That's why I also do it. But so essentially that's how one goes about it. And then, yeah, so that's what it would entail.
Okay, that's great. Just going to go back to Anne for probably the last question of the night.
Okay.
Okay, well, there's one that came in, it's quite long, but just what I think the point that the person's trying to make is that they tend to hyper-focus, which I guess comes up a lot with ADHD, and that what they find themselves is that they've been told they don't focus on the task at hand, and that they work too much. So the question really is, how can they manage that? How can they work more efficiently, even though they already create a lot of lists and priorities, but it doesn't seem to help in terms of avoiding that hyper-focusing. So what I think what they're trying to understand is, how can they work more effectively and efficiently and avoid the trap of hyper-focus?
The trap of hyper-focus.
That's my words now, not hers.
Yeah, no, what you're saying. No, hyper-focus. I was just trying to get from the question, or maybe my own mind wondered why where's the hyper-focus the problem? I was just trying to understand that.
Well, it seems to be that they end up working too long on things because they go down a rabbit hole, I suppose, of something in particular captures their attention, and they end up spending too long as far as their work colleagues or, you know, their co-workers are concerned. So they're being asked, can they work, you know, work less is what the person has put here, but more efficiently.
Okay. Well, let me just
think the question.
Great.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't know if you were gonna have time, like seeing that 2 minutes left, but basically it's deadlines and time management. It's a consistent feedback I get that's damaging my relationships at work.
Yeah,
I'm spending too much time on something, and some people have got really irritated with me because of it, and it looks like I as a result, I'm also skipping lunch, skipping dinner, you know, and I'm losing track of time, and I just don't know how to manage it, because although I make lists and I make priority lists, and sometimes I even have alarms on to tell me to stop, I don't. I'm just like engrossed in what I'm doing.
Okay, but when you say engrossed in what you're doing, it means, is it fun what you're doing, or?
It's not always fun.
Right, because hyperfocus, I mean, the question is, you know, hyperfocus means when I'm hyperfocusing on something, it's usually very meaningful to me. You know, the classic hyperfocus in ADHD is when you're hyperfocusing on something, is, you know, hyperfocus, you wouldn't usually hyperfocus on something you don't want to do. So my question is a little bit, you know, is it really hyperfocus, or are you trying to do something, you know, are you trying to do something very perfectly or very right, or, Is maybe the task kind of like not structured in a good way, or is there something else going on? I mean, my question is it really hyperfocus, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I do it for things I like and for things I don't like.
Well, the things you like, hyperfocus usually, I mean, for things you don't like, that doesn't sound so much like hyperfocus, I would say. I mean, there is, of course, hyperfocus, and, you know, in research, we know that hyperfocus actually is why hyperfocus happens, or this is the theory at the moment, is to kind of block out other information coming in. So essentially, as a defense mechanism, almost, your brain kind of narrows the focus very much. It's almost like the opposite of what's happening. Now, of course, it could also happen with something you don't feel so strongly about, but then your mind would start wandering again. So, I mean, we would need to talk more about that, but I'm not entirely sure that it's hyperfocus.
Okay.
But I mean, you know, I'm just from the little bit what you're saying, because the reason why that's important is because you know, there are different strategies on how to work with that. The other issue is if you feel you're doing things in a certain way, and you know, and that would work, then of course often it's possible to talk maybe even to the people at your company and your employer and say, well, you know, I need my work structured in a different way. But I would look into that. Is that really hyperfocus? Would be my sense.
Okay. That's at 8:30, so I think we have to just let Jonathan go home at this stage, or walk back into the kitchen.
I'm already sitting at home.
So on behalf of ADHD, I'd like to thank, you know, particularly Jonathan. And if you see any of you can do reactions, you put up a little, oh, hey, you can have one of those. Really appreciate it. It was really informative, and it was great to get the human perspective rather than just naturally the medical profession. And just to say, you know, we really appreciate it. We are doing a series of these at the moment. We should have another one coming up next week on emotional regulation. And we have a big international conference coming up on June the 13th. If anybody's interested, we're doing mindfulness in the morning at 10 o'clock. Support groups are all online. So we're keeping going. I hope you're keeping going. We'll see you out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.